My name is Eleanor Miller. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in Minnesota my whole life. I never thought I'd tell this story out loud, but sometimes the silence gets so heavy that speaking becomes the only way to breathe. It all started on a day that was supposed to be beautiful. My son's wedding. I had spent weeks getting ready. I pulled out the pink dress I had kept wrapped in plastic for years, a soft fabric with gentle pleats that always made me feel a little younger, a little more seen. I baked the banana bread Ethan used to love as a boy, even though I wasn't sure anyone would want it. And I ironed my favorite cardigan, the one with the tiny pearl buttons that Henry, my late husband, used to say made me look like one of those classic TV moms. When I stepped into the venue, a modern lodge near the lake, I could already feel something tightening in my chest. People were gathered in clusters, laughing, sipping champagne, the air buzzing with energy that somehow didn't seem to have room for me. A young woman at the reception desk smiled politely and handed me a name tag. Just Eleanor. No mention of being the mother of the groom. Not even a ribbon. I stared at it for a second longer than I probably should have clipped it on and told myself not to read too much into it. Inside, the tables were arranged beautifully close to the glass windows that overlooked the lake. Each table had cards with neat little labels. Groom's coworkers, bride's extended family, maid of honor's parents. I scanned the room, hoping, maybe praying for one that said mother of the groom. There wasn't one. A man in a headset waved me over to a table, pushed near the far corner close to the side doors and a rack of folded chairs. My place card simply read Eleanor. No last name. No title. No role. I sat between a woman who raised alpacas in Vermont and a man who sold insurance in Ohio. They smiled at me, then quickly turned toward each other and spent most of the evening in a conversation that floated right past me like I wasn't even there. Every now and then, one would toss me a polite nod or a small comment about the weather, but their words always slid back toward each other like water finding the quickest way downhill. From my corner, I could see Ethan, my Ethan, laughing with his new wife Samantha, greeting her relatives like they were old friends. He danced with her, then her mother, then an aunt I didn't recognize. Not once did his eyes scan the room looking for me. Not once did he walk over. When the toast started, the microphone passed from Samantha's father to her brother, and then to her college roommate, who told a story about tequila shots at some spring break I had never heard about. Someone nearby asked if the groom's mother would speak. Samantha laughed and said maybe later. Then she moved on. The food arrived, but I barely touched it. A dry piece of chicken, a buttered roll that stayed on the edge of my plate. Even the lemon tart for dessert tasted more bitter than sweet. I kept folding and unfolding the corner of my napkin, pretending to fix it, pretending to be busy, pretending not to notice how no one noticed me. By the time the lights dimmed for the first dance, my table was already half empty. People excused themselves early, drifting toward the parking lot with murmured goodbyes that didn't include me. I sat there in that rented chair with the smell of melted candle wax and half-eaten plates around me, and realized something I never thought I would. I wasn't really part of this day. Not the way I should have been. Not the way a mother should be. When I finally stood to leave, no one turned their head. No one stopped me at the door. I walked out alone, the soft click of my heels against the tile sounding louder than any word anyone had spoken to me all night. When Henry died, it felt like the air got thinner. One moment we were a family of 3, the next it was just Ethan and me against the world. He was only 8, with a backpack too big for his little shoulders and eyes that looked at me like I had all the answers. I didn't. But I pretended I did because that's what mothers do. The weeks after the funeral were a blur of paperwork casseroles from neighbors and nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how on earth I was going to hold everything together. Henry had life insurance, but not much. Enough to keep the lights on for a few months, maybe. After that, it was all on me. I applied everywhere that would take me. I started cleaning offices at dawn, wiping down glass doors before the world woke up. After that, I clocked in as a cashier at the corner grocery store, smiling at customers while my feet screamed beneath me. Nights were for data entry. The job was boring but quiet, just me and the soft hum of the old desktop computer clicking numbers into boxes until my eyelids grew too heavy to fight. I didn't mind. Not really. Because every time I saw Ethan's face, every time I packed his school lunch or helped him with his math homework at the kitchen table, I remembered why it mattered. He was a good kid, kind, smart, always polite. He never asked for much, but I still wanted him to have what the other kids had. When his classmates went on field trips, I found a way. When he wanted a second-hand bike, I worked an extra weekend shift to surprise him. Christmases were simple but magical. I learned how to make paper snowflakes baked cookies in shapes that never quite looked right but always tasted like love. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when I skipped dinner so he wouldn't see how tight things were. I patched his jeans so many times the stitches started looking like part of the design. Once when the car broke down, I walked 2 miles to work in the snow pretending it was no big deal. I did it all gladly because Ethan was my world. I never remarried. People asked why, but the truth was simple. My hands were full. My heart was full. There was no space for anyone else. My life revolved around raising a boy who would grow into a good man. Or at least that's what I believed. As Ethan got older, I noticed little shifts. The hugs grew shorter. The calls became less frequent. But I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up. They build their own lives. That's the point of all this, isn't it, to raise them well enough that they don't need you forever? So when he met Samantha, I smiled. I told him how happy I was for him, and I meant it. Samantha was sharp, polished, the kind of girl who had plans for everything and didn't waste time on small talk. She was kind enough at first, but there was always a distance in her voice, like she was speaking through glass. After they got engaged, that distance grew. Ethan stopped dropping by as often. When he called, it was usually quick squeezed between meetings or errands. I would ask about wedding plans, offer to help suggest baking something for the reception, but the answers were always the same. They had it covered. Don't worry, Mom. Just come and enjoy. I told myself not to take it personally. Times were different now. Young people plan their weddings differently. Maybe they didn't need as much family involvement. Maybe. But deep down, a small ache began to grow. Not sharp, not sudden. Just a quiet sadness, the kind that settles into the cracks when you realize you've started fading from the center of someone's life into the background. I reminded myself that this was how it was supposed to be. I had raised him to be independent, to build a life of his own. But I never expected that in building his life, he might forget the hands that built his foundation. I held on to the memories because they were all I had left. The mornings making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The way his tiny hand used to fit perfectly into mine when we crossed the street. The way he used to say, "Love you, Mom," without thinking, like it was as natural as breathing. Somewhere along the way, those little moments became relics of a past that no longer had a place in his present. And I began to wonder if a mother's love was meant to be invisible once it had served its purpose. I pulled into Ethan's driveway, feeling a strange mix of nerves and hope. His new house sat in a quiet neighborhood with perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. It looked like the kind of place built for family dinners, laughter, and long conversations. I straightened my cardigan, smoothed the front of my blouse, and grabbed the tin of oatmeal cookies I had baked that morning, thinking maybe this dinner would help bridge whatever gap had started growing between us. Ethan answered the door with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His hug was brief, barely more than a polite squeeze on the shoulders. He told me to head straight to the kitchen while he poured us some wine. As I stepped inside, something felt off. There were no smells of food, no pots simmering on the stove, not even the faint scent of garlic or bread. The table was set, sure, but there were no plates. Just 2 wine glasses, 2 folded napkins, and in the center, a neat stack of papers clipped together with a blue pen resting on top. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Ethan sat down, gestured toward the seat across from him, and slid the papers forward like he was handing me a menu. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as he explained that this was something simple. Just a durable power of attorney, he said. Nothing complicated. Just in case something ever happened to me. His tone was casual, as if we were talking about the weather. I reached for the first page, my fingers trembling slightly before I even realized it. The words blurred for a second, but when they came into focus, they landed like ice in my chest. Immediate authority. Full financial control. No expiration. No oversight. No mention of care, love, or family. It didn't say son. It said agent. It didn't say protect. It said authorize. The language wasn't gentle. It was absolute. He kept talking using words like practical, responsible peace of mind. I barely heard him. My eyes were still locked on the line that said effective upon signing. I realized then that this wasn't dinner. There was never going to be dinner. I wasn't here as his mother. I was here as an asset. A signature. A formality in someone else's plan. The cookie sat untouched in my lap, still warm beneath the foil, but suddenly they felt ridiculous. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced a small nod like I was still listening. But all I could hear was the quiet breaking of something I hadn't realized could still be broken. I placed the papers back on the table, letting my fingers rest there for a moment longer than necessary. I told him I wouldn't be signing anything tonight. My voice was steady, maybe too steady, like someone reading a line they had rehearsed in their head but never thought they'd actually have to say out loud. Ethan's smile barely flickered. He nodded as if he expected that response and leaned back in his chair with a calm that felt rehearsed. He kept the polite tone, pushing the pen slightly closer, tapping it twice against the folder like it was just a simple reminder. No rush, he said. Take it home. Think about it. His words were sugar-coated, but the way his eyes drifted toward the papers told a different story. This wasn't a conversation. It was a transaction dressed up as concern. I scanned the room while he spoke, noticing details I hadn't paid attention to when I first walked in. No smells of dinner. No dishes in the sink. Not even a stray crumb on the counter. The table was set, but only halfway. No silverware. No serving bowls. Just space for the documents. I realized then that there was never going to be food. The entire invitation had been a setup. Not for a meal. Not for a catch-up. But for this. Ethan talked about how everyone does this nowadays. Said it's just being responsible. He used phrases like protecting the family, making things easier, looking out for the future. But all I could hear was the quiet scrape of something shifting deep inside me. Something that had always been soft now started to feel sharper. Not anger. Not yet, but a kind of clarity. A line being drawn. I nodded again, but this time not because I agreed. Only because I needed the moment to end. I told him I'd review everything carefully. He smiled wider a little too quickly and slid the pen back on top of the folder, as if to remind me it was still waiting. We exchanged a few more hollow words about the weather, about how nice the neighborhood was. But something between us was no longer the same. And it never would be again. I didn't bother taking off my coat when I got home. I walked straight through the front door, past the kitchen, and down the basement stairs, letting the cold air settle around me. My hands moved on instinct, flicking on the pull-string light and stepping carefully over the boxes stacked near the wall. I knew exactly where I was going, though. I hadn't opened that cabinet in years. Tucked behind a shelf of old paint cans and broken garden tools was a small metal box, the kind Henry always insisted we keep for important things. My knees cracked as I knelt down, brushing away a thin layer of dust before pulling it free. For a moment, I just sat there staring at it, wondering if I really wanted to open it. But something deep inside told me I had to. Maybe I always knew this day would come. The latch stuck at first, but with a little force it popped open. Inside, everything was exactly how Henry would have left it. Neatly stacked folders, labeled tabs in his familiar blocky handwriting. Beneath the folders, tucked between a worn manila envelope and an old key, was a letter. My name was written across the front. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. His handwriting hit me like a punch to the chest. Steady, certain, full of the kind of care only Henry ever had for me. The words were simple. He told me he knew how stubborn I was, how I would never ask for help, even if I needed it. He wrote that he had set things up so I would never be dependent on anyone, not even Ethan. He warned me that people change when money's involved, and sometimes the ones you trust most are the ones who forget where they came from. I wiped a tear from the corner of my eye and reached for the folders. The first was a portfolio summary. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, a retirement account I never even knew existed. The second folder held documents for a property in Florida. A small beach house, paid off in full. The numbers on the final page made me blink twice, thinking I had read it wrong. $6,842,000. My breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. For a long time, I sat there on the cold basement floor, staring at those numbers like they might disappear if I blinked too hard. But they didn't. They stayed right there, as real as the concrete beneath me. Slowly, the weight in my chest began to shift. What started as fear and betrayal earlier that night began folding into something sturdier. A kind of quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. Henry had seen something coming long before I did. He had protected me in a way I didn't even realize I needed. And now it was my turn. Not just to protect what he left, but to protect myself. The next morning, I pulled out an old address book from the kitchen drawer, the one with frayed corners and ink stains from years of coffee rings. Flipping through the pages, I found the number I hadn't dialed in nearly a decade. Carol Thompson. We had met back when our kids were still in middle school. She was a trust and estate lawyer before she retired, one of the sharpest women I'd ever known. If anyone could help me now, it was her. When she answered, her voice sounded older, but still firm, still steady. I didn't waste time explaining the details over the phone. I just asked if she had room for coffee and a serious conversation. She told me to come by that afternoon. No hesitation. No questions. Carol's home was as meticulous as I remembered. Stacks of legal books lined the shelves, and the smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. I laid everything on her dining table. The letter, the folders, the numbers that still felt unreal even as I read them again. Her eyes scanned every line without flinching. When she finished, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and said exactly what I needed to hear. You have more power than you realize. We worked for hours. Carol walked me through every step, explaining how to move everything into a revocable trust in my name alone. No one could touch it. not without meeting strict conditions. She added medical clauses that required not one, but two independent physicians to confirm permanent incapacity before anyone could ever gain control. There were backup trustees listed, none of them family. No loopholes. No gray areas. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground steady under my feet. Every signature, every initial, every dotted line felt like sewing up a wound I didn't even know had been bleeding for years. By the time we slid the final papers into a thick folder, something inside me had shifted. The weight was still there, but it wasn't crushing anymore. It was mine now. Mine to carry. Mine to protect. Walking out of Carol's house, I didn't feel like someone's forgotten mother. I felt like a woman with a spine, with choices, and for the first time in a long time with power. I pulled into Ethan's driveway just as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows over the perfect rows of suburban homes. His house looked the same as before. Tidy, polished, a picture of stability. But now I knew better. I sat for a moment, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel, breathing in the weight of what I was about to do. The porch light flicked on as he opened the door, smiling wider than necessary. His arms spread open like he'd been waiting all day just to see me. He wore a button-down shirt tucked neatly into khakis, no shoes, just socks, like he wanted me to remember the boy who used to run barefoot through our kitchen. I stepped inside, letting my eyes sweep the space. This time, there were smells. Roasted vegetables, garlic bread, something in the oven that actually smelled like dinner. The dining table was set silverware, in place wine glasses already half full. A loaf of bread sat in the center, flanked by a small bowl of butter and a candle burning low. For a brief second, I could almost believe this was just a dinner between a mother and her son. Almost. Then I saw it. A stack of papers on the side table by the wall. Clipped. Highlighted. A pen resting neatly on top. Ethan gestured toward the chairs, pouring me more wine before I even asked. His voice was softer this time. "How have you been, Mom? Have you been getting out much?" He asked about the weather. About my tulips. About anything except the reason I knew we were both here. We danced through small talk as he ladled soup into our bowls. Tomato bisque. Warm. Creamy. Perfectly seasoned. His hands moved gracefully, like someone trying to distract from the real performance waiting in the wings. I let him go through the motions. Let him serve the salad, pass the bread, refill my glass. I nodded in all the right places. Smiled when expected. But my hands never strayed far from the leather folder tucked beside my purse. As the main course arrived, a roasted chicken with lemon and herbs, his tone shifted. A little slower. A little more deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and glanced toward the papers waiting on the side table, like they were whispering to him. He started carefully. Said he had spoken with a friend in elder law. Said they recommended a simpler arrangement this time. Nothing binding, just provisional, just something to make things smooth if anything unexpected happened. His fingers tapped the edge of his water glass, then slid toward the documents, pulling them closer as he spoke. His words were dressed in concern, but underneath was that same hollow pitch. The same quiet urgency wrapped in politeness. Just sign this. Just make it easier. Just trust me. I waited until he finished his rehearsed explanation, then let the silence breathe for a few seconds longer than comfortable. Without a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out my folder. Slowly, carefully, I placed it on the table, letting the soft thud of leather against wood cut clean through his last sentence. His eyes flicked down, confused for half a second. Then he unfolded the top page. I didn't rush him. I sat back, sipping my wine, letting him read every word. The trust document was straightforward: full transfer of assets into a private trust. Revocable only by me. No authority granted unless two independent physicians declared me permanently incapacitated. No room for negotiation. No gray areas. No back doors. I watched as his face shifted. The practiced smile faltered. His jaw clenched, then loosened, then clenched again. He tried to hold on to the mask, but his eyes gave him away. Blinking faster. Jaw tightening. A muscle twitched just beneath his left cheek. I spoke softly, but every word landed like stone. I told him I appreciated his concern, that I understood life was unpredictable, that planning ahead was part of being responsible, but I had already taken care of it. Everything was in place. Everything was final. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His fingers hovered over the edge of the trust folder, tapping once, then twice, like he was searching for a response that wouldn't come. Then his shoulders sagged just a little. Not enough to look defeated, but enough to show he knew the game was over. We finished dinner in silence. Or rather, I finished. He mostly pushed his food around, glancing now and then at the folder like it might change if he stared hard enough. When the plates were cleared, I stood, gathered my purse, slid the folder back inside, and walked to the door. He opened it for me, but this time the smile didn't come. Not even a forced one. Stepping out into the night, the air felt crisper, cleaner. I breathed it in like something earned, like something that finally belonged to me. 2 days after that dinner, my phone buzzed while I was folding laundry in the living room. I didn't rush to check it. Something in me already knew it wasn't a message filled with warmth or reconciliation. When I finally picked it up there, it was. A single line sitting on the screen. You made this harder than it had to be. No hello. No mom. No hint of care or regret. Just those words. Short. Sharp. Surgical. For a moment, I stared at it, letting the weight of it settle, wondering if it should hurt as much as it might have a year ago. But it didn't. Not really. There was no sting, no sharp ache pressing behind my ribs. Only a strange kind of quiet, like someone finally turned off a noise I hadn't realized had been humming in the background for years. I set the phone face down on the table, feeling the familiar ache that used to come every time Ethan disappointed me, but this time it was different. It wasn't grief. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. A clean break where confusion used to live. That text said everything I needed to know. It wasn't about disappointment or misunderstanding. It was about control. About a door he believed would always stay open, only to realize it was now firmly, permanently closed. I thought back to the years I spent trying to be everything for him. All the late nights. All the scraped knees and science fair projects. The snow days spent building forts. The birthday cakes baked from scratch even when I could barely afford the flour. None of it was a transaction. None of it was meant to be repaid. But now I saw something I had refused to see before. Somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped seeing me as his mother. I had become a resource, a convenience. Oddly enough, that realization didn't break me. It freed me. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and watched the sunlight filter through the window. For the first time in a very long time, I felt weightless. Not because I had lost something, but because I had finally let go. I sold the house not long after. The place felt too big, too quiet, and far too heavy with memories that no longer comforted me. I packed the things that mattered. A photo of Henry that always sat on the bookshelf. The recipe cards with faded ink and butter stains. My chipped blue kettle and a ceramic owl that once guarded the garden but never scared away a single bird. The new house was smaller, older, tucked on a quiet street in a lakeside town in Wisconsin. It had crooked shutters and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left, but it felt right. Not because it was perfect, but because it didn't need to be. The lake wasn't far. Some mornings, the water was so still it looked like glass. Other days, the wind carried little ripples across the surface, and I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, letting the silence fill spaces that used to ache. I started spending time at the local library not because I needed books, but because I liked the way it felt. Safe, steady, quiet, but not lonely. Eventually, I began helping out at the front desk. Just a few hours here and there. Enough to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering into places that didn't serve me anymore. That's where I met them. Women like me. Women who had carried too much for too long. Helen, who used to run a diner and now made quilts from her late husband's shirts. June, who always brought peppermint tea in a thermos with her sister's initials taped to the side. And Margot, who walked with a cane but never used it until she reached the library steps, as if her body only allowed her to be fragile in certain places. We weren't loud. We didn't call ourselves a group. It just happened. Slowly. Organically. One afternoon, Margot mentioned the garden bed behind the library overgrown and half forgotten. She asked if anyone wanted to help clear it out. I said yes, before I even thought about it. The next day, we showed up with gloves, shovels, and a determination that didn't need to be spoken. The dirt was stubborn, hardened by years of neglect, but we worked one row at a time. We planted tomatoes, basil, and a handful of sunflowers just because they made us smile. Some days we worked in silence. Other days we traded stories. Not the kind where you pour out every wound, but the kind where a simple nod says, "I understand." We started bringing tea to share. Some mornings it was too cold to dig, so we sat on the back steps, hands wrapped around warm mugs, talking about nothing and everything. We didn't talk much about our children. Not because it hurt, but because it wasn't who we were anymore. We weren't just mothers or widows or women someone once forgot. We were something else now. Something solid. That little garden became more than just a patch of earth. It became proof that things could grow again. That life could begin again. Not because someone made space for us, but because we made it for ourselves. I felt something shift in me, something soft but sure. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was already here. Rooted. Whole. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. The house was quiet, but not the lonely kind. It was the kind of quiet that feels like an exhale after holding your breath for too long. I picked up my pen and began to write a letter, not to Ethan, not to anyone else, but to the woman I used to be. I told her she didn't need anyone's approval to be worthy, that her kindness was never a weakness, that all the times she bent herself in half to make others comfortable were never meant to define her. I reminded her that being loved isn't something you earn by being useful. It is something freely given, or it isn't love at all. I forgave her for the years she stayed silent, for thinking that staying quiet kept the peace. I told her she was allowed to stop carrying everyone's weight, that she could sit down now. The load had been heavy enough for long enough. I thanked her for surviving, for never giving up even when the world made her feel invisible. When I finished, I folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of an old cookbook I hadn't opened in years. I stood and baked myself a small cake. Just one layer. Nothing fancy. While it cooled, I lit a single candle, placed it right in the center, and closed my eyes. I made a wish not for anyone else, not for anything grand, but for my own peace. My own beginning. When I opened my eyes and blew out the flame, the room didn't feel quiet. It felt earned. It felt like mine.